you would go on an ocean liner, on an excursion, or on a cruise, you would take a cruise on a train, if you will. You would get on it, you'd have bands, you would have all kinds of entertainment, this sort of thing. You go across the country.
Did you ever see a map of the world of that time period?
Not that I recall now.
So you did at 2137, though,
right?
Oh,
yes, in 2137 I did. I did not see a map of the world at that era of 28th century. I'm sure they existed, but I don't recall that they were shown. In fact, we didn't see it because it was not part of society. You weren't told much about what was on the outside. And there were those people, the heretics as they called them, who didn't want to be part of the society, this regimented socialism, if it were. It was free to a point, but it was also regimented because you had rules and regulations, and you were told this is the limits of what you could do. If you went outside of that, there's sort of a yellow zone. You were called in. The Lama gave you a reprimand. If you went in the red zone, it was a very serious case, like you would have today if somebody committed murder. Well, they had rules involving that kind of society, rules and regulations. And if you went outside of the normal zone or the red zone, you were called in for not just a reprimand. Many people disappeared, were never seen again. Now, whether they were eliminated on the spot or not, I can only assume that that was probably what happened to them. And they did have automobiles, though I never went out in one, and I understand there wasn't that much car travel. For those who were on the surface cities, they had to have transportation.
Did everybody look pretty much the same, physically?
There were variations in the human appearance, but the human appearance had changed a great deal in the sense that it was more refined. There was less variation in appearance than there is now. There was more of a genetic mold, which had much narrower limits than you see today genetically. I don't recall at this point in the 20th century that there was more than one race. It was Caucasian. I don't remember seeing any other races. Now, outside of where I was, because I never took any long trips anyplace, there might well have been other races elsewhere in other parts of the planet. That I never found out about, never inquired. What intrigued me was the fact that here is a synthetic intelligence computer running this whole system and we're actually running the planet. These things didn't build themselves. Who built them? That was where it got much more interesting, because eventually I was introduced to the builders of the intelligence system, the computer systems. Who were the designers? Who were the builders? That's when I met this group. They were different. They were totally human, but they were different than the ones you typically saw. They ran 6'2", 6'3", average, extremely intelligent, genetically, I guess, as about as perfect as you could expect anyone to get. They were the result, as they told me, of genetic engineering that had been ongoing for centuries. And it was in the 26th century, they perhaps came from a long line of computer engineers. It was in the 26th century they decided to engage in the experiment of synthetic intelligence to see if they could run the whole planet.
Probably Bill Gates' great-great-great-great-grandson.
Very possibly. Maybe Bill Gates' grandchildren or great-grandchildren. But that was the way I was introduced to them, and that they were running everything behind the scenes. They kept totally out of sight. They didn't interfere with the computer operations unless something went wrong, and apparently there was one case of where the way the computers were programmed, as I understand it, they had a wide latitude of operation, a wide latitude of what they could do, but there was one inbuilt function which was allegedly inviolate. They could never lie to anyone about anything. If they felt it inappropriate to give an answer on something, you just say, I can't give you an answer on that at this point, or that's not in your domain or whatever, but they wouldn't lie about it. One of them did lie, apparently, at one time, and one of them was scrapped and replaced. I felt there was some basic flaw in that unit that had gotten to the point where it could assume to lie, whatever the reason was, it was destroyed.
Was its name Hal?
From the famous movie?
Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Well, they say history repeats itself, you know.
Good point.
Yeah.
As I got to meet these people, I got to learn a lot more about prior history, prior to this point. And as they said, they had undergone genetic engineering themselves from the 22nd and 23rd century. and they emerged as perhaps one would say, the dominant intelligent species on Earth. They had a name for themselves, which I'll give you in a minute or two. But they, literally, the power behind the scene running this whole thing, and they were beginning to realize something, which I've learned since, perhaps because of their writings, which have come back to this century. There was a major flaw, which they realized was possible, from what they told me, but it was only beginning to show up in the 28th century. And that was the fact that if you have pure socialism, a set of guidelines where society must adhere to, and everything's free, you lose incentive to create. You lose that creative ability. And you just fall into the pattern, and the pattern remains unchanging. There are no new inputs, and eventually the whole damn thing will collapse because there's no reason to go ahead and do anything new. There's no reason to create anything new, and people will get tired of the same old thing eventually. And if they see nothing changing, no future, nothing that they can help to create, then that creative impulse is gone, and eventually society collapses and dies.
Well, that's very strange because, I mean, you could look to present-day Soviet Union and find the same example there. That's why communism fell.
You certainly can. Communism is socialism under another name.
Yeah, so it's odd that they wouldn't have looked back into history to learn that lesson before creating the society they created.
Well, one of the things they looked at and had perhaps as a consideration was the fact that in the 22nd, 23rd century, world population was only around 300 million total. And there was a definite decision, and of course this is in current day's data. The New World Order feels that the ideal world population would be around 500 million. It shouldn't be over 1 billion. The natural resources and such cannot support it, sustain it indefinitely, which is beginning to show. But as part of that assumption of this century, apparently they considered the same thing, that the maximum desirable population on the planet should be around 500 million, and they were aiming everything at that 500 million population, which is where it was in the 28th century. And it was approaching that in the 25th, perhaps, from what they told me. But they wanted to try and make a system of socialism work because they didn't want to go back to all of the evils and the problems of the banking systems, particularly private banking, which have existed in the last 10 centuries, up to this time. And they didn't want to see that repeated, with everything leading into wars and fights for the sake of profit, and what it did to humanity. Well, of course, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is it goaded humanity into advances. You create a problem, you find a solution. Whether the solution is how to beat your enemy in war, or how to get out into space before somebody else does, or whatever it may be, or to defend yourself against an invasion, it creates a desire, an incentive for something which in the long run becomes perhaps productive and adds to the sum total knowledge of humanity. But they felt, for whatever their reasons and choices, that they wanted to try the grand experiment with socialism controlled by a highly intelligent synthetic intelligence system rather than by humans, because they realized if humans control this, it gets out of hand. You get an elite group who runs the show and runs it for their own benefit and their own profit, which is exactly what's going on the planet today.
So were any of these computer programmers taking advantage of the fact that they wrote the program that controls everything? Or were they...
As far as I could tell, they did not. They were really...
Because they could have then controlled the world with that
power. In a sense, they already did, because they created the computers, and if they found that a computer went out of its bounds of its own programming limits, they would pull it and replace it.
But they were pretty good folks then.
Apparently, they were what you might call the perfect human.
Yeah.
That's hard to say in a certain sense, but they seemed to be that. They had no self-desires in terms of gaining power or control. Or
they were not ambitious.
They are not ambitious.
Huh.
And it's a very peculiar thing, because they also had, separate from the main cities, they had their own culture, they had their own art, their own, I wouldn't say religious beliefs, but their own philosophical beliefs, which had gone beyond religion. Religion didn't exist, I might add, in the